Good morning, dear students. We broke off, I think, shortly before, from our first batch of reading, the long passage in which Stern and the narrator provide us with a long disquisition on the matter of baptism, about which I intend to ask you a question in our quiz. I just want to draw your attention to the wonderful example in chapter 20 of volume 1 of starting off in the middle of a conversation, and in the middle of a conversation which itself is a nonsense. He starts off chapter 20, "How could you, madam, be so inattentive in reading the last chapter?" We don't know who this madam is who suddenly is the reader. Nor do we know what he's talking about. "I told you in it that my mother was not a papist." And she replies, "Papist? You told me no such thing, sir." "Madam, I beg leave to repeat it over again. I told you as plain, at least as words, by direct inference, could tell you such a thing." Well then, sir, I must have missed a page. So, quite unfairly, very unfairly, the author, the narrator, in this instance, me, falls flat on his face. I didn't, but my engine, my device did. Take that to be similar to the black page in Stern, not because there's anything to mourn, but because suddenly I take it that your screen went black. Not normally a part of a video that you would read, but there it was. And we were in the middle of looking at the extraordinary rudeness of Stern and the storyteller in accusing a madam who's suddenly been chosen as the reader of not reading properly. Go back and read it again. And what she has to go back and read again, I will ask you about in the quiz. And then, very typically, what happens when we've sorted this out, there's a big noise and fuss in the background as well. There might be, with the lady of the house giving birth, but the men, of course, pay no attention whatsoever. In fact, they sit in what he calls an hour-and-a-half silence, so that Uncle Toby can smoke his pipe in mute contemplation of a new pair of black plush breeches. Lovely, expensive pants, which he had got on. So that provides that and smoking provide the foreground, to which the background of his wife giving birth means virtually nothing to Walter, and even less to her brother-in-law Toby, but he manages to say something. "What can they be doing, brother?" said my father. "We can scarce hear ourselves talk." They haven't been talking for an hour and a half. It's typical. "I think," replied my Uncle Toby, taking his pipe from his mouth and striking the head of it 2 or 3 times upon the nail of his left thumb as he began his sentence. "I think," says he, and he must be about to say, "I think this noise is a fuss over your wife, who is in childbirth," but he never gets to saying it, because Stern says, in order to enter rightly into Uncle Toby's sentiments upon this matter, for Uncle Toby, a very complicated, painful and traumatic matter, the matter of the consequences of sexual intercourse, something, as I will ask you in the quiz, provokes a very painful reaction in Uncle Toby because of his past. And so Stern says, before you understand the strangeness of Uncle Toby's reaction to childbirth, you need to know a little more about his character. And that's the end of as far as he gets, because instead it occurs to him to reflect upon the eccentricity not just of Uncle Toby, but of the entire English race, and he cannot resist the consequent digression. Pray, he says to the reader, what was that man's name? For I write in such a hurry, I've no time to recollect or look for it. Actually, Stern was writing this in a hurry. He wrote this book in extraordinary speed, the first volumes of it, who first made the observation that there was great inconstancy in our air and climate. This is English air and English climate, famous for its inconstancy. Whoever he was, 'twas a just and good observation in him, but the corollary, like the consequences, drawn from it, namely that it is this which has furnished us the Brits, with such a variety of odd and whimsical characters. Now, that was not the man who commented on the inconstancy of our weather. It was found out by another man, at least a century and a half after him. Then again, that this copious storehouse of original materials, the circumstances of being English, is the true and natural cause that our comedies are so much better than those of France. Actually, they were at that time, or any others that either have or can be wrote upon the continent. Not only better than any comedies that have been written, but any comedies that could be written on the continent, sur le continent, in continental Europe, cannot possibly match up to English comedies. At this period, I would have to agree. That discovery was not fully made till about the middle of King William's reign, when the great Dryden, blah, 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 and on he goes. So he's then prepared to go on considerable length about the extraordinary inconstancy of the British weather and its effect on literature. There's something to be said for that. I remember playing cricket as a boy in England, and the rain would come and we'd continue playing, and then it would get rain harder and we'd have to run off the field of play, and then the sun would come out and then we'd play for a bit, and then it would pour with rain and we'd go in, and then the sun would come out again and we'd play. This is not unheard of, I know, but it was the very essence of English summer weather in those days, and quite possibly back into the 18th century as well. And Sterne's argument here, or at least Tristram's argument here, is not entirely unsupported by theories of national character, that this extraordinary mixture of weathers, inconstancy as he calls it, creates a temperament, the English temperament, and creates the greater likelihood of odd and whimsical characters than, I suppose, would be the case in Finland, where at least an Englishman would imagine that there is no great inconstancy, or you're hot or you're cold. Not true, of course, but there's something to be said for a special quality in in English weather, to which can be attributed all kinds of Englishness. This is what distracts Tristram and Sterne for a moment, as well it might. Then, yes, I need to warn you that I'm about to ask you to trace to its source a much quoted and very provocative remark of Pope's that appears in Pope's epistle to a lady, epistle being a letter, but these epistles were poems. And I've asked you to track down who originally said it. Pope wrote it, but that doesn't mean it was he who originally said it. And even in the poem, you can find it. The Penguin note about it may not be sufficient. I'm setting you off on a piece of detective work to answer who is actually responsible for this unkind remark. Most women have no characters at all. And what is meant by that in that century would mean that they have no ruling passion, the defining element of character, which is a fancy way of saying hobby horse, really. That women are, as was then firmly believed, fickle in their emotions, inconstant, rather like the weather, and therefore could not be said coherently, consistently to have a character that you could describe. Why men should be any better is impossible to figure out, but those of you familiar with the absurdities of patriarchal culture will know that it doesn't take logic, good reason to produce a nonsense such as this about women. But its origins are slightly more interesting than at first appear, and so I'm going to send you on what I hope is not a wild goose chase, but a search. So, in due course, in this section that we've read, we move towards an understanding of Uncle Toby's history and hobby horse, about which I propose to ask you, and finally, by no means too late, or certainly soon enough, much needed, Dr. Slop arrives to help with the birth. The birth of our storyteller, which after 100 pages isn't any closer, but perhaps a bit closer because of the presence of Dr. Slop. However, Dr. Slop arrives on his tiny horse, and Obadiah, a servant who's been sent to track Dr. Slop down, they encounter each other. They come around a corner just as Dr. Slop reaches Shandy Hall, and there's a terrible collision that takes place, which might have been less terrible, and I'm tempted to ask you this, but for an act that Sterne or Tristram attributes to papism, which makes the collision much worse for poor Dr. Slop. And it's a very twisted attack on papism, but a good Anglican clergyman, a Protestant clergyman like our author, Sterne, would not miss an opportunity to have a dig at Roman Catholicism, i.e. papism being faith in the Pope. And that conditions the catastrophe, the little minor catastrophe that is Dr. Slop's arrival. Meanwhile, they're talking, the men are talking about, Dr. Slop joins them, and the men talk about sex. And what could I do to make your life better, cries his brother to Uncle Toby. And Brother Shandy, replies Toby, you are much mistaken, for you do increase my pleasure very much in begetting children for the Shandy family at your time of life. Bit of a dig there. But by that, sir, quoth Dr. Slop. Dr. Slop is now in the parlour, part of the conversation. Mr. Shandy increases his own, i.e. his own pleasure in love-making. Not a jot, quoth my father, not prepared to admit that he does it for pleasure. My brother does it, quoth my Uncle Toby, and a whole chapter is devoted to this, out of principle. In a family way, I suppose, quoth Dr. Slop. Pshaw, said my father, 'tis not worth talking of, and thus ends the chapter. So the issue of talking about sex is a vexed one. It definitely comes to our character's mind at this moment of birth, of the birth of his latest child, and Walter is reluctant to admit that he gives him any pleasure whatsoever to engender children, and leaves the other two abashed by this, at the time at any rate, very English prudery about the matter of sex. So I wish you a pleasant morning. It's sprinkling down with rain. There's no harm in that. I wish you nice mild weather such as we have, and I wish that you would keep yourself socially distant, keep yourself alive. Take no risks, my dears. It's just not a good time to take a risk. So I send you fond regards from the countryside, from the mountainside. Take care. Bye.